Harpley Church in West Norfolk is one that I return to time and time again. It may not be in the top rank of Norfolk churches, most of which are to be found along the north and east coasts. But in the west of the county, there are pockets of wealth, and Harpley is one of them. The village is about 10 miles to the east of King's Lynn, in a predominantly agricultural area. And the interest of the church lies predominantly in the fact that it was rebuilt by two men a century apart. And I just love comparing the work of those two periods. On the north side, the extent of Sir Robert Knowles' rebuilding can clearly be seen, with this wonderful run of perpendicular windows, not just in the north aisle but in the clear story too. Sir Roger was a great soldier. He'd fought for us in the 100 Years' War, had been heavily rewarded and purchased property in Norfolk. He also built in Pontefract, which is where his wife came from, and in Rome, where he built a hospital for English pilgrims. So this was really one of his crowning glories, to rebuild this church, not only for the glory of God, but also for the glory of Sir Robert Knowles. The church is built of flint, the local building material, but the dressed stone, the windows, the corners, are all made of limestone, imported from the neighbouring county, a distance of about 80 miles by water. You can clearly see Sir Robert's extensions to the church, where the roof was raised to take this row of clear story windows. The horizontal dividing line between the old and new work is easy to see. Here on the south side, we can clearly see the differences between the two periods of work. Behind me is the chancel, built by John Gurney in the early years of the 14th century. The south aisle there, with its parapets and battlements and that wonderful south porch that we saw at the beginning, the work of 100 years later by Sir Robert Knowles. And here on the battlements are Sir Robert Knowles' coat of arms. Here I am in the south porch of Harpley Church. Porches were a communal meeting place for the population. Transactions were carried out here, and so this is why we have these stone seats running around either side of the porch. Big light windows to bring in the light to make this a usable space. And behind me is the great treasure of this church, this wonderful doorway dating from the early years of the 14th century. The door is original, and you can see that it has a wicket door in it, a small door, so that you don't have to open the big door to let people into the church. And on either side of the door itself are carvings. And we have the four doctors of the Latin Church. Here is St. Jerome, very easy to spot him because of his cardinal's hat. And we have lots of other carvings on the door too. So we have these two eagles, an angel with which would have had the shield of arms of the donor of this door, who was a member of the Knowles family, and we'll hear more about them later. Here in the porch you can see where various generations of local residents have left their mark in inscriptions in the porch. Sometimes not just their names, but designs as well. This is very typical of this type of stonework in medieval churches, where graffiti was certainly a free-for-all. Right, let's go in and have a look inside the church. As we saw from the outside, it's quite a large church. We're standing in the nave, looking down to the chancel, and to either side there are aisles. The whole church is seated, it's got medieval benches, but not all is as it seems. At the back of the church, these benches are all medieval, and they have that curious Norfolk speciality, the pierced backs. So they've got a variety of designs. Most of the designs are based on the quatrefoil, but you see there's some nice arcading along the big back of this one as well. And at the ends of the benches, we have a variety of subjects. They all start off with a poppy head, but then down on the arm of the seat is an animal. These are all different, and you'll see that they are pretty much undamaged from the 15th century. The reason they've remained undamaged is, of course, that they are non-religious. In other parts of the church where we did have religious symbolism, they've sadly been damaged. When we get to the front of the church, we realise that what we thought were medieval benches are not all they seem to be. This one, right at the front, has an inscription on it which records the date in which it was created, and that's 1638. So this is what we would call Gothic survival. It's work where normally architecture and design of the period had moved into the classical form, but in particular areas, certainly in remote areas like this, we were still using Gothic, and this was a deliberate attempt to copy and match the benches of previous periods. Dividing the nave and chancel is the rood screen. It's pretty much intact from the early 1400s. It's lost its loft, which would have sat on top of the screen there and which would have disappeared at the Reformation. But below that, most of the woodwork is original. The painting, however, is not. It's a spirited attempt in the 1870s to put some colour back to it. In the north aisle, this small doorway behind me was the entrance to the rood loft staircase. Within the hollow of the wall was a staircase which came out on the left-hand side of that arch and gave access to the rood loft on top of the rood screen behind. As you can see, it also had its own internal window to give light to people accessing the stairs. The painting on the screen itself is from the 1870s. It actually gives a good impression of what medieval screens were like. We're now in the chancel of the church, and behind me you can see the three arches that represent the three seats of the sedilia, the seats for the priest, deacon and subdeacon at Mass. And next to them, this double arch is the piscina, the area where the priest would wash his fingers and the chalice before Mass. When you find a piscina with two drains, as this one has, you know it dates from the end of the 13th or beginning of the 14th centuries. Most piscinae are single drains, but just in this one period of history, you find the double bowls being used. We know it's a piscina because it has a drain hole in the bottom, and in this particular piscina, there are two drains. We're now looking west from the altar, and in the floor of the chancel is one of the most amazing survivors in this church. This monument is the grave slab of John Gurney. John Gurney was the man who paid for this chancel to be built in the early years of the 14th century. It's what we know as a matrix, a stone that originally held a brass depicting the deceased. The brass has long gone, but its outline survives, and you can quite clearly see that it was a man in robes, because John Gurney, as well as being the man responsible for the rebuilding of this church, was also the patron and the parish priest. If you look carefully, around the edge of the slab is an inscription. This is in what we call Lombardic text. It's a very distinctive form of text, and it says in Latin that this is the resting place of John Gurney, and we hope that God is pleased with his soul. It's very rare that we have a tangible link with the person responsible for the rebuilding of a church. And here it is in its original position, as it has been since the 14th century. Sir Robert Knowles' work in the early 15th century involved the complete rebuilding of the nave. He raised the walls and inserted these windows on north and south side, the clear story, in order to bring more light into the church, and then put on this exceptional roof. It's relatively plain in Norfolk terms, but as you can see, it contains lots of wonderful carving of angels and shields of arms, including, of course, Sir Robert Knowles himself. The crowning glory to any rebuilding scheme in the Middle Ages would be the insertion of stained glass. And we're only 25 miles from Norwich, a great centre of glass production in the 15th century. So Sir Robert Knowles filled his large new windows with painted glass. The window behind me, which is probably the greatest architectural device in this church, has still got a lot of its medieval glass surviving. So let's have a look at some of the subjects that can still be seen. The colours are typical of Norwich glass of the 15th century. And something else which is very much a hallmark of the Norwich school is the use of feathering in bodies and legs in particular. Most of this glass was produced by 3 or 4 different studios that were working out of Norwich and whose work may be found surviving in several Norfolk churches. Of the many saints in the window, here is St. Stephen with his stone of martyrdom, whilst above, dominating all, is Sir Roger himself, the donor of the church, asking us to pray for his soul in the afterlife. There's also another window I'd like to show you. It's just above the kitchen area here in the northwest corner of the church. Today the glass is completely plain, but it's that plain glass that gives us some fascinating insights to people who were here before, because it contains all sorts of graffiti, some put in by the people actually making the window, the plumbers and glaziers, but others recording aspects of life here in Harpley in the post-Reformation period. Here we have an inscription that refers to a hanging. It makes you want to delve into the local records to discover the story behind this inscription. The font is in its traditional position at the west end of the church and close to the north and south doors, but it is completely Victorian, part of that 1877 restoration. The carving is just too crisp and the design completely unlike anything you would have found in the Middle Ages. I hope you've enjoyed your visit to St Lawrence's Church, Harpley, and can see why I'm so excited about it. There's something for everyone, and I think that's what the study of English parish churches is all about, discovering the details that give you pleasure.